Is the setup already ready? Streaming? All right. Friends and colleagues, welcome to this seminar. This is the last seminar of the academic course. Welcome, Gabriele, to this university. Gabriele is an assistant professor at University of Bologna. He did his PhD at KTH in fluid dynamics, and then he moved to the United States to University of California at Berkeley for a postdoc, and then he joined as an assistant professor at Bologna. His main research field is turbulent flows, right? Mainly experimental fluid mechanics. And he contributed to the design and construction of this infrastructure, which is quite singular, Cyclop. He's going to be talking about it. So, welcome again, Gabriele. Thanks very much for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction and for inviting me, and to all of you for coming. What an honor to close the seminar session. So, yes, the reason why I decided to come back to the University of Bologna was because of this interesting project, the Cyclope Laboratory, which is a laboratory designed and optimized to study wall-bounded turbulence. And this is what I will talk about today, and in particular, the presentation will be scheduled, divided in, I'll talk about three main topics. First, I will introduce turbulence in aeronautics. So why do we care to study the details of turbulence in aeronautics, and with specific focus on commercial aviation, which is second part will be to explain why we need to do experiments at high Reynolds number, what is the role of Reynolds number in turbulence research, and in particular, how this is connected to the design of the Cyclope Laboratory. So I will give you some insight about this lab. And the final part of the talk, I will discuss the results and the future outlooks of this research field. And after that, we'll go to lunch, hopefully. So, turbulence in aeronautics. And when you talk to normal people and you mention turbulence, all that people have in mind is the plane shaking and then people being afraid of the shaking. So what planes are designed basically to bear with this shaking. That's some kind of turbulence. We know it's a large-scale feature of atmospheric turbulent flows. But what we focus on here is the turbulent flows that on a much smaller scale that goes across over the surface of the plane, on the wings and on the fuselage. Okay, that's what people should be more scared of, because that actually is causing some problems. And in particular, we know it can be estimated that fairly 50% of the fuel burned by an aircraft is due to turbulent friction. So it's not the total drag of a plane, because there are other factors, as most of you know. There's induced drag and other factors, but 50%, so half of the fuel that is burned by the plane, is due to skin friction. And this skin friction is increased by the presence of turbulence. So turbulent flow is characterized, as you know, by the fact that there are fluctuations. So the fluid particles do not move in nicely parallel streamlines, but they are characterized by chaotic motion. This chaotic motion increases skin friction a lot, and therefore it causes a penalty in terms of drag. So it comes natural for us as engineers to wonder how can we reduce drag, in particular turbulence drag. So the first, and there are several strategies for that, the first and most natural idea that comes to mind is to prevent turbulence to occur. So we want to try to delay the transition from laminar flow to turbulent flow. There's a lot of research dedicated to that. This can be done. It would be nice because laminar flow has a much lower, characterized by much lower dissipation and drag. So this can be done if smart people have tried to manipulate the mean flow by arranging some vortex generators or small array of cylinders. And in fact, it is possible to stabilize the laminar flow. What you see here are pictures taken in a wind tunnel. So the flow is coming left to right. This is the upstream region. This is the downstream region. And if you properly manipulate the flow, you're able to make it more stable and more prone to avoid the transition to turbulence. This actually is a picture taken on the same plate and the same wind tunnel. Here you have laminar flow, modified laminar flow, and here you have turbulent flow. So this is possible to do, but it's very difficult, and it's even in a wind tunnel where you have all control. It's a little bit more difficult to apply it on a real plane where there is a lot of more variability and conditions. So another, we have to think about something else. So turbulence is stubborn, so especially at high Reynolds number. So the flow wants to be turbulent. So another strategy is to reduce to learn to manipulate turbulent fluctuations. And nature somehow has done that. If you typical example is the shark skin. The shark skin is not smooth like we make the skin of an airplane. We try to make it as smooth as possible because so far is the best we can do to have a low skin friction. But nature has learned to design, for example, the skin of a shark with some kind of pattern. These patterns can also be applied not only in water but also in aerodynamic flows, and it's been proven that these riblets can, if properly designed, can reduce skin friction drag by up to 10% if properly optimized. There's theory behind why riblet work in some kind of ranges somehow developed and understood, at least in some range, to the point that these riblets are nowadays applied to some full-scale commercial cargo planes. People have cleverly designed some foils that contains the riblet pattern. These are applied to the fuselage of cargo planes, and they can indeed reduce drag. Of course, there is the picture when you go to a real plane is not as high as 10%. In fact, it has been measured to a drag reduction of about 1%, which may seem very small, but if you look at the numbers, this corresponds to 300 tons of fuel saved per plane. Okay, so it's a small percentage, but still a significant contribution. Is it enough? Well, certainly it's not enough if we want to meet the goals that are set. These quite, let's say, important goals that are set to reduce by 30% the emission of the next generation airplane by 2013, which is like tomorrow. So if we want to achieve this, of course, we cannot only act on aerodynamics, we have to combine structure, propulsions. That's what you guys are doing here. But of course, we need to do also something on aerodynamic devices. And in order to do this, we need to effectively manipulate turbulence. And in order to effectively manipulate turbulence, we must first understand, deeply understand turbulence. As you all know, turbulent flows are characterized by fluctuations. Okay, so unlike laminar flow where the particles are steady in time, turbulent flow is characterized by fluctuating particles. It's quite chaotic motion. It's chaotic, but not random. It's not random because turbulence has a structure. So fluctuations are, let's say, correlated to each other. And this correlation is what causes an additional stress. It's like when you run on a highway and when you have parallel lanes, if there is a fluctuation of a slow track towards the center, that causes the whole highway to slow down. You can see it a little bit that way. And these terms are called the Reynolds stresses. So it's very important for us to understand the origin and the statistical characterization of the turbulent fluctuations. By the way, these turbulent fluctuations, they cause, of course, a strong change in the mean velocity profiles and, of course, on the skin friction. Problem is, we don't have the analytical tools to predict the onset and the the development of these fluctuations. So, and not to mention the algorithms that would be needed to sort of interact with these fluctuations to reduce them. Okay, so all we have is some scaling arguments. Scaling arguments are of this kind. So we know that mean flow and turbulent fluctuations are a function, of course, of the wall normal position. There will be a function of the skin friction. By the way, this is an important quantity to keep in mind. This is called U tau. U tau is basically a velocity scale that can be derived starting from the skin friction. Okay, so if we have a flow, a wall-bounded flow, this will have a certain value of the shear stress at the wall, and this shear stress of the wall can be used to derive a velocity scale. And from this, we can derive a viscous length scale, so L star. L star is sort of the analog of the Kolmogorov length scales for wall-bounded flows. So these are the L star are the smallest scales of turbulence when a wall is involved. And U tau, it's a velocity scale that can be derived from the skin friction. In this sense, the Reynolds number, we can define a Reynolds number which is based on R, let's say the outer scale, pipe radius, for example, of our flow, U tau, and the viscosity of the flow. This is called the friction Reynolds number. The friction Reynolds number, if you look at the definition of viscous length scales, can be seen also as a ratio between the outer scales of the flow, so the geometry of our pipe, and the smaller scales generated by turbulence, okay? Or allowed by viscosity, so to speak. So these are the variables that are involved in our problem. From if we properly manipulate, we reduce the number of variables with proper dimensional analysis, it turns out that basically all the fluctuations can be described either with what is called the inner scaling or with the outer scaling. So if we take as a reference the smallest scale of turbulence, we obtain a certain function, and we assume that this function is valid where? In a region close to the wall where viscosity, say, it's more important. And this other function will be more or accurate in the outer region of the flow where geometry will be important. And in the limit, if you assume that Reynolds number becomes high, which means that there is a large scale separation between the larger scales and the smaller scale, these functions will be, we expect them to become independent of Reynolds number. So if we want to basically describe our mean velocity and turbulent fluctuations, we will need just to find a function of only one variable. Okay? And in addition to that, we may argue that there is a region in between these two scales where both functions are valid, and this gives rise to the famous log law, saying that basically the derivative of the dy is constant, is equal to say that there is a logarithmic growth of the mean velocity in the region where both laws may be valid. So that this is called the overlap region. So you understand that the Reynolds number here has a crucial role. So if we want to properly characterize these functions, if we properly want to describe turbulent fluctuations and the onset of these additional stresses, we need to properly investigate the flow in a proper range of Reynolds number. The problem is that typically laboratory wind tunnels are relatively low Reynolds number because of practical reasons. So the wind tunnel can be only that big, and we can only reach certain speed and so on. Whereas applications are characterized by very high value of Reynolds number. So we must extrapolate our results from low Reynolds number to high Reynolds number. And this is not always easy, also because there might be things happening that in between that are not fully understood. So there is a need for new facilities operating a high Reynolds number. Okay? So there is a gap between the typical laboratory experiments and the application. So why there is this gap? Of course, it's not because we are lazy, just we want to make a small experiment, but because there are a number of challenges that are associated with designing facilities that are optimized to measure in a range of a high Reynolds number. In particular, let's discuss what are the requirements for a high Reynolds number facility. First of all, we said that a really crucial parameter for our scaling laws is U tau. And what is U tau? Is basically skin friction. So the facility that is designed to accurately determine the scaling laws, we must be able to accurately determine tau wall. Second of all, we had to cover, obviously, a wide range of Reynolds numbers, not only to reach a certain Reynolds number, but we want to span a wide range of Reynolds number. So we had to generate a flow somehow, characterized by a high Reynolds number, and we had to accurately measure velocity fluctuation. So it's not enough to generate a flow of high Reynolds number, otherwise it would be easy, we'll measure up on a plane, okay? But it is very important that we are able to accurately measure velocity fluctuations. And of course, the facility has to be stable, low noise, and repeatable, because the differences, the trends that we are looking at are characterized by subtle differences. So we need high accuracy and low noise level. So let's start from the consideration of the fact that we need an accurate measurement of U tau. So typically, boundary layer flows, they're evolving spatially, like the flow that we have over a surface of a wing. It develops in space, which means that tau wall cannot be directly measured. But to measure tau wall, we need to characterize what this is called the momentum thickness. Somehow it's a relative of the entire velocity profile. So if you want to determine tau wall, we need to measure the entire velocity profile, which is not very easy to do. Otherwise, we have to find other ways to measure directly skin friction. Internal flows, though, internal flows like a fully developed pipe or channels, what does it mean fully developed? It means that the flow is in equilibrium. So the flow does not evolve anymore in the streamwise location. So there is an equilibrium between forces in the system. So the skin friction is in equilibrium with the pressure gradient. Okay, so we can, in internal flows, we can determine skin friction through pressure gradient measurements. And somehow measuring pressure gradients with pressure taps along the channel or the pipe is relatively easy, or at least easier than having to measure skin friction directly. So internal flow, that's why we sort of chosen to go for an internal flow. Then, once you have decided on an internal flow, you decide you want to have a pipe or a channel. So the main advantage of having a pipe is, first of all, cost, because for a given size, for example, the pipe radius or the channel height, which determines the Reynolds number, you need a lot less area, okay? So you need to drive a lot less flow, and so you save energy to drive the flow. And another important feature is that with DNS, with pipe, you don't have corners, and corners are not, they sort of generate some deviation from canonical flow conditions, which are not reproducible in DNS. So with pipe, you can match almost exactly the condition that you might have in numerical simulations. So that's the reason why we went to a pipe. Then, what about the range of Reynolds number? So what does it mean, high Reynolds number? It is somewhat generic statement. Of course, high might mean also close to our target application. So we need to get close to the Reynolds numbers or typical of aeronautic applications. But we can also give somehow a more physical interpretation. So high means that at least we have a clear separation of scales. So the large scales are sufficiently separated from the small scales that an overlap region appears. And you remember the overlap region means that we have somehow a logarithmic growth of the mean velocity profile. Here we're looking at the mean velocity scaled by u tau, and this is the wall position in a logarithmic scale. So this is the wall, let's say. Actually, up here is the wall, and here we're going towards the center of the pipe. The velocity, of course, wants to increase, first linearly. A linear increase in logarithmic space, it's some kind of parabola here. And then we expect to have a region where the velocity increases linearly in a log plot. Okay, having a sufficiently high Reynolds number means that we have at least a well-developed logarithmic region. And if you carry on the math, since the logarithmic region starts by at y plus 200 or around that value, of course there's some debate also where this value starts, we have that the minimum Reynolds number, friction Reynolds number at which we have a development of a decent log law, it's Reynolds tau 13,000, okay? It's an order of magnitude estimation, it's not an exact number, okay? Then, of course, from here, you want to explore a range, because if we want to extract trends in our measurements, we need to explore a range which is at least 3 times that. So this gives us the range in which our facility wants to operate, between 13,000 and 45,000 or something like that. As we said, generating a high Reynolds number flow is not a sufficient condition, because we must be able to measure accurately a Reynolds number. And what is the problem of measuring a flow at a high Reynolds number? So here, it's a nice picture. This is taken from direct numerical simulations from El Kuori in 2013. So this is an extremely low value of Reynolds number 180. You still see some turbulent features here, mainly large-scale motion. When you increase the Reynolds number, what happens? The large-scale feature remains, but you start to see also finer structures, which means that Reynolds number is basically, you can see it as a high-pass filter. The higher the Reynolds number, the higher the cutoff frequency, okay? Because the flow has, you can see the inertia of the flow allows a smaller scale to develop and for a fixed value of viscosity. So the smaller scale have higher and higher energy. So if we fix the external geometry of our facility, when we increase the Reynolds number, what happens? The size of the small scales decreases. Okay, so if we want to further increase, and we said we want to go to Reynolds tau up to 50,000, this circle becomes extremely small. So the smaller vortices, let's say, we had to resolve, become very, very small. And what is the problem with that? Is that if we fix the size of our instruments, of course, our instruments start to lose resolution. And if we start to lose resolution, we basically are not able to accurately measure our turbulent fluctuations. So what is the instrument that we use to measure turbulent fluctuations? Well, the main tools that we use, they are hot wire anemometry. Why hot wire anemometer? It's a small piece of wire, resistance, which is heated by current and basically exchanges heat with the surrounding fluid as a function of the local velocity. So, and the small wire is able, why do we use this? It's because a hot wire is able to follow the time fluctuations of our turbulent flow very accurately. So in other words, it has the highest temporal resolution of all measurement instruments that we can typically use in turbulence research. But of course, the size of the hot wire, it can be made small, but not too small. So the size of the smallest hot wire that we can manufacture, say a wire length of 120 microns, typical hot wires go from 1 millimeter to 0.1 millimeter, and this is an extremely small wire, has to be, say, comparable with the size of the turbulence scale. So, because the smallest hot wire is 120 micron, we say that the smallest turbulence scales generated by our facility, they have to be larger than, say, 12 microns, because it has been shown that basically if you want to avoid spatial averaging, L plus, so the ratio between the hot wire size and L star should be no larger than 10, okay? So by this consideration, we say that our smaller scales have to be 12 microns. Our facility has to operate a Reynolds tau larger than 40,000. Now you remember the definition of Reynolds number as the ratio between the radius and the smaller scale. So from this we can compute that the radius of our facility has to be larger than at least roughly alpha meter. Okay? So our facility has to have 1 meter of diameter if we want to accurately measure with standard hot wire the turbulent fluctuations. If we have 1 meter diameter, of course, we cannot make just a short section of a pipe, because we said we need a fully developed pipe flow. So, and how many diameters do we need to allow for fully development of pipe flow? Well, there are sort of also a lot of opinions on that, but we say we must be at least above this blue line here. So for our Reynolds number, this means that L over D, so the ratio of the pipe diameter over the length, has to be above 100. Okay, so we need roughly a 100 meter long facility, which is quite large facility to install in a standard lab. Okay, so the special facility needs a special location. So these are the features basically of a facility that must satisfy if you want to accurately measure a high Reynolds number. And that's the reason why there are not so many facilities of this kind. So we need to have, let's say we've chosen a pipe flow, we need a closed circuit because we want to have control conditions, and we must have a diameter of at least 90 centimeters and a total length of 100 meters. So this is the result, and the resulting design from this specification. It's a pipe flow of this kind. So we have a long pipe flow. How long? It's 110 meters. It's made of carbon fiber because it has to have a really smooth inner surface. That was pretty much, carbon fiber was pretty much the only way to manufacture 100 meter long pipe. Of course, it's made of several sections with an extremely smooth inner surface because we don't want roughness to affect the turbulence. And everything is embedded in basically a giant wind tunnel. So we have the two fans that are driving the flow, and we have all the features that originate laminar flow at the inlet, so that we have a natural development of the turbulence within the pipe. And of course, we have temperature control, because hot wires are calibrated at a standard temperature. And our measurements, they may last for hours. Stefano and Andrea may remember our long sessions of measurement in Ciclope, so they may last for hours, and hours of measurements, the temperature must be kept constant so that our hot wire is also stable. So talking about special location. So this facility is located near Bologna, in a small village on the hillside near the city of Forlì. And this small village in Italy is sadly known because it was the hometown of Mussolini. And of course, this is the reason why there was this plane factory, Caproni factory. It was an important plane manufacturer at the time. And so Mussolini asked this guy to build this plane factory in Predappio. And in front of this plane factory, there were two large tunnels underground, which were built for strategic reasons. And the long pipe is hosted within one of these tunnels. Okay, one of the nice things is that there are a lot of nice restaurants, nice local regional restaurants up there, which is one of the main reasons I think why they've chosen this location for this installation site. And so these are some pictures of how the facility looks like. So you see there's this large pipe, there's an alignment system that guarantees that the pipe is straight, because over 100 meters you might have misalignment that deflect the flow and create pressure gradients that are unwanted. And you have basically pressure taps in several sections of the pipe. And from pressure taps, you remember why do we need to have pressure taps? Because we want to determine U tau from the calculation of pressure drop. And then we have possibility to install precise traverse systems and also some optical insert to measure the flow not only by hot wire but also with other technique like particle image velocimetry. So what are the issues that are addressed in Ciclope? Well, we are addressing, of course, some of the most fundamental questions that are sort of open in turbulence research. Some of these are, first of all, is the flow is this, let's say, log law, this famous log law, is independent of the geometry? Is it the same log law that we have in pipe, boundary layers, and channels, and so on? This is a relevant question because this sort of, it's the underlying assumption of basically most turbulent models. About turbulent fluctuations, is the inner peak of variance depending on Reynolds? So in particular, let's focus on this question. So this graph, which I will explain in a second, it basically took an entire PhD thesis after the pipe was built to construct. What is this? So this is the streamwise velocity variance scaled in inner units. Okay, so the value of streamwise variance as a function of the wall position. Again, here we have the wall, and here we are going to the core of the pipe, and this is scaled in inner units, which means that the wall position is scaled in terms of the viscous length scales. Okay, so in a way, this is, you can see it as a sort of local Reynolds number. As we go to the pipe center, we go to the Reynolds number at which we are doing the experiment. As we move close to the wall, the Reynolds number decreases, and that's why we assume that viscosity is more important. According to the scaling law that we have seen, we expect that as the Reynolds number increases, this function becomes independent of Reynolds number. Okay, which means that all these curves should collapse onto the same curve. Okay, and it's an open question and a relevant question to know whether they do or not, at least in the region near the wall. Okay, so these figures, and this is quite challenging to build this figure, because here we have at y plus 15, it's a really important point in the flow, because that's where we have the maximum, the peak of turbulence production. So that's where turbulence is produced within the flow. So we are very close to the wall. Y plus 15 means that a high Reynolds number, we are 12 microns times 15, so we are 0.1 millimeter from the wall. So also the probe positioning becomes very, very, very challenging. So the control on probe positioning and everything affects a lot this curve. So after a lot of work, we were able to measure this curve. And what we see here is that basically up to Reynolds tau 40,000, this curve do not collapse, which means that there is still a Reynolds number effect, and this function has not yet become independent of Reynolds number. So if we plot this against data in the literature, we have seen that a low Reynolds number, this trend was observed. Then there are some measurements taking an extremely high Reynolds number done by atmospheric measurement. People went out to the desert and measured the flow generated by the wind up in the desert. And there was basically a gap between these two measurements. Our data confirm actually that there is this logarithmically increasing trend of the so-called inner peak. Why do we care about this? Do we care if it increases or not? Well, we care because this may indicate that there are some mechanism which is connected to to the outer region, which affects the flow all the way down to the wall. And if we want to learn to control turbulence, we must understand this mechanism. So if we investigate the spectral signature, basically the frequency content of our fluctuations at that point, so here we have wave number, let's say here we have small scales, and here we have large scales. And this is the energy contained at the particular length scales. We see that the main differences, the main reason why this curve does not collapse here is because there is a mismatch at the low wave number region, which means that basically the inner peak variation is due to the contribution of the large scales. Okay? And this was observed also in turbulent boundary layers. Turbulent boundary layers, they have observed that there are self-organizing, somehow, large structures that span a range of scale which is much larger than the typical scale of the boundary layer, or in this case, of the pipe radius. And they interact all the way to the wall. So we have done some experiment here with the group also by Stefano Discetti and Andrea Ianiro. They came to our lab, and we combined hot wire measurement with PFV measurements to find a way to observe and detect these large organized structures that span a region of the flow which is much larger than the pipe flow. Okay, and this was all published in a nice paper where we were able to detect when these large organized structures were passing through our pipe. And once you can detect them, you can also analyze them. So what we see here is basically the spectral content, of our turbulent fluctuations. Again, here we have wave number, and the colors is energy. So this is what is called the energy associated with the inner peak. But we see that when the Reynolds number increases, there is a large amount of energy which is associated also with the large scales. Okay, and this is the so-called outer peak. And this is important because it means that as we increase the Reynolds number, although energy is produced near the wall, there is a large amount of energy which is associated with these large-scale features. So if we want to design some strategy or some new way to control the flow, we must address also the energy associated with the large scales, which somehow it's maybe also a good news because large scales are also slow, so it may be easier to control large scales with a slower actuation mechanism than what it would be required if the energy was associated with the small scales. And we also observed that by looking at the correlation maps, that these large scales, they are somehow they are attached to the wall, which means that although they are large, so they occupy basically the central region of the pipe, they go all the way to the wall, and that's why we see that signature all the way to the inner peak. This was also confirmed by some other measurements where we basically try to measure the shear stress at the wall, and what you see in this map, the red regions are regions where we have high level of shear stresses and other regions where we have low level of shear stresses, and you see that there are long streaks of high stresses which are associated with the large scales. And we also carried on an analysis to see that these large scales, they are also self-similar and they have a well-defined aspect ratio. So all this is pointing at the fact that as the Reynolds number increases, the large-scale features become increasingly important. These larger scale features are strictly connected with the near wall mechanism, so they can be probably tickled by near wall actuations, and they also contain a lot of energy. So this point at a possible control strategy which should be targeted at very large scale motions rather than the scales associated with the small scales at the wall. Important role, what about the future? An important role in this may play DNS, direct numerical simulation. So we mentioned experiments, we did not mention simulations so far. Why? Why is that? It's because as we increase the Reynolds number, the number of grid points needed to fully resolve the flow increases strongly. You see that if you want to reach Reynolds number of 10,000, you almost need a trillion of points, okay? However, computational power is increasing, so nowadays we start to see the first direct numerical simulation that are overlapping with the operative range of Cyclope. This, to some extent, should worry me because I may have to retire soon if the DNS go too quickly. But on the other hand, it's an unprecedented opportunity to have a matched DNS where we can access the entire flow field with experiments, and experiments yet they can easily span a much wider range of Reynolds number. At the same time, there are people around the world developing miniature probes that can further increase the resolution of our measurements, and there are people developing other types of large-scale facility, which allows us to compare the results from our pipe flow to, for example, boundary layer measurements like in the large-scale wind tunnel in Melbourne, and other pipe flows in Japan, which runs in water rather than air. The future goals would be nice to developing devices that are targeted at large-scale features and tested in a relevant range of Reynolds number. This is some work that we might be doing together also with Stefano and Andrea. And with this, I conclude this seminar and I leave you up for questions. So thank you very much for your attention.